Okay, we're going to try this again because I seem to be having terrible luck with this today. But this is a quick review from the last chapter. In chapter 16, we get a glimpse into the life of the three pirates. Joe Harper is starting to show that he's getting quite a bit homesick. And Huck and Tom Sawyer try to make it a little bit better for him by coming up with a new game to play. Instead of playing pirates, they're now going to play Indians. And one of the things that they're going to do as Indians is they're going to smoke a pipe because that was one of the things Indians were known for back then. So we know that Huckleberry does not have any family or parents to kind of hold them accountable. So he's already dabbled into smoking a little bit. He's a little bit more used to it. But when Tom Sawyer and Joe Harper first try and take their smoke, then they really struggle. They get quite sick to their stomach, and they tell Huckleberry that they need to go, into the forest to find the knife that they lost, quote unquote. When really they're just going into the forest to throw up and get sick because they are not handling the smoking very well. So that's what they mean when they said that eventually they were proud of themselves because they were glad they could take a whiff of the pipe without having to go and quote unquote search for the lost knife. So that was that was chapter 16. Today we're going to get in chapter 17. And the general overview of chapter 17 it's kind of set up in contrast to the carefree life of the pirates of Tom and Joe and Huck. But back home, everyone is really suffering because they really think the boys are dead. So chapter 17, we see that it's come to be Sunday afternoon, and the deal was that if the boys didn't return by Sunday, then they would go ahead and declare them dead and have the funeral. So chapter 17 is about how the funeral happened. But there was no hilarity in the little town that same tranquil Saturday afternoon, which means peaceful. The Harpers and Aunt Polly's family were being put into mourning with great grief and many tears. An unusual quiet possessed the village, although it was ordinarily quiet enough in all conscience. The villagers conducted their concerns with an absent air and talked little, but they sighed often. The Saturday holiday seemed a burden to the children. They had no heart in their sports and gradually gave them up. So basically, everyone's pretty depressed because they know that the boys are probably dead. In the afternoon, Becky Thatcher found herself moping about the deserted schoolhouse yard and feeling very melancholy or depressed. But she found nothing there to comfort her. She soliloquized. All right, this is a really big word. A soliloquy is a type of poem, which is basically just an outward expression of emotion or how one is feeling. So in the next little bit, we're going to see Becky express her feelings out loud. Oh, if I only had a brass and iron knob again, but I haven't got anything now to remember him by. And she choked back a little sob. Presently she stopped and said to herself, "It was right here. Oh, if it was to do over again, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say it for the whole world. But he's gone now. I'll never, never see him any more." This thought broke her down, and she wandered away with tears rolling down her cheeks. Then quite a group of boys and girls, playmates of Tom's and Joe's, came by and stood looking over the paling fence and talking in reverent tones of how Tom did so and so the last time they saw him, and how Joe said this and that small trifle, pregnant with awful prophecy, as they could easily see now. Real quick, this kind of pregnant is probably not what you're thinking of when you hear the word pregnant. It just means that whatever Joe said probably held a little bit more prophecy in it. Basically, looking back now on what he said before, they can kind of see how he was hinting at the fact that they were going to run away. And each speaker pointed out the exact spot where the lost lad stood at the time, and then added something like, "And I was a standing just so, just as I am now, and as if you was him, I was close as that." And he smiled just this way, and then something seemed to go all over me like, "Ooh, awful, you know." And I never thought what it meant, of course, but I can see now. Then there was a dispute or an argument about who saw the dead boys last in life, and many claimed that dismal distinction and offered evidences more or less tampered with by the witness. And when it was ultimately decided who did see the departed last and exchange the last words with them, these lucky parties took upon themselves a sort of sacred importance and were gaped at and envied by all the rest. Basically, the children began to argue about who saw Tom and Joe last and who did he talk to last, etc. One poor chap who had no other grandeur to offer said with tolerably manifest pride in the remembrance, "Well, Tom Sawyer, he licked me once." But the bid for glory was a failure. Most of the boys could say that, and so that cheapened the distinction too much. It's a little concerning that a lot of the boys can claim that Tom Sawyer licked them, but I guess boys will be boys. The group loitered away, still recalling the memories of the lost heroes in awed voices. When the Sunday school hour was finished next morning, the bell began to toll instead of ringing in the usual way. Basically, the bell sounded a little bit more sad than normal because it was announcing the start of the funeral. It was a very still Sabbath, and the mournful sound seemed in keeping with the musing hush that lay upon nature. The villagers began to gather, loitering a moment in the vestibule, or like the lobby, basically, to converse in whispers about the sad event. But there was no whispering in the house. Only the funeral rustling of dresses as the women gathered to their seats disturbed the silence there. None could remember when the little church had been so full before. There was finally a waiting pause, an expectant stillness, and then Aunt Polly entered, followed by Sid and Mary, and they by the Harper family, all in deep black, and the whole congregation, the old minister as well, rose reverently and stood until the mourners were seated in the front pew. There was another communing silence, broken at intervals by muffled sobs, and then the minister spread his hands abroad and prayed. A moving hymn was sung, and the text followed, "I am the resurrection and the life." As the service proceeded, the clergyman drew such pictures of the graces, the winning ways, and the rare promise of the lost lads, that every soul there, thinking that he recognized these pictures, felt a pang in remembering that he had persistently blinded himself to them before. Not too far. And had as persistently seen only the faults and flaws in the poor boys. Basically, the preacher or the minister, as he began to talk in the service, he talked about how wonderful the boys were. He brought up all kinds of good memories and good things they had done, so much so that everyone in the crowd began to feel guilty because they had always thought of those two boys as troublemakers. The minister related many a touching incident in the lives of the departed, too, which illustrated their sweet, generous natures, and the people could easily see now how noble and beautiful those episodes were, and remembered with grief that at the time they occurred, they had seemed rank rascalities, basically, that at the time these events happened, they just referred to these boys as rascals, that were well deserving of the cowhide or a whipping. The congregation became more and more moved as the pathetic tale went on, until at last the whole company broke down and joined the weeping mourners in a chorus of anguished sobs, the preacher himself giving way to his feelings and crying in the pulpit or on the stage that he was preaching from. All of a sudden, there was a rustle in the gallery, which nobody noticed. The gallery is like an extra room off to the side of the auditorium where everyone is gathered for the funeral. A moment later, the church door creaked. The minister raised his streaming eyes above his handkerchief and stood transfixed. He was just staring. He was so shocked he couldn't move. First one, and then another pair of eyes followed the minister's, and then almost with one impulse the congregation rose and stared while the three dead boys came marching up the aisle. Tom, Joe next, and Huck, a ruin of dripping rags, sneaking sheepishly in the rear. They had been in the unused gallery, listening to their own funeral sermon. So basically, these boys had been hiding out in the extra room, listening to the preacher talk about how wonderful they were, hearing all the good stories, and now here they come walking down the middle of the aisle. Everyone assumed they were dead, and now they're about to be the most popular people in the room. Everyone is just so thankful they're back. Aunt Polly, Mary, and the Harpers threw themselves upon their restored ones, smothered them with kisses, and poured out thanksgivings, while poor Huck stood abashed and uncomfortable, not knowing exactly what to do or where to hide from so many unwelcoming eyes. Remember, Huck has no family, so there's no one there to, be so thankful and come running up and hug him and grab him, so thankful he's alive. He wavered and started to slink away, but Tom seized him and said, "Aunt Polly, it ain't fair. Somebody's got to be glad to see Huck." Good old Tom, sticking up for Huckleberry Finn. "And so they shall. I'm glad to see him, poor motherless thing." And the loving attentions Aunt Polly lavished upon him were the one thing capable of making him more uncomfortable than he was before. Suddenly the minister shouted at the top of his voice, "Praise God from whom all blessings flow! Sing, and put your hearts in it." And they did. Old Hundred swelled up with a triumphant burst, and while it shook the rafters, Tom Sawyer the pirate looked around upon the envying juveniles about him, and confessed in his heart that this was the proudest moment of his life. So basically, he looked around at all the other kids who were so jealous of the fame and love he was receiving and decided this is the proudest moment of his life. As the sold congregation trooped out, they said they would almost be willing to be made ridiculous again to hear Old Hundred, the hymn they sang that day, sung like that once more. Tom got more cuffs, or kind of like light beatings, basically, and his day, according to Aunt Polly's varying moods. Basically, one minute Aunt Polly was mad at him for putting through that kind of stress. The next minute, she was just incredibly thankful he was there. Than he had earned before in a whole year, and he hardly knew which expressed the most gratefulness to God and affection for himself. So now these boys are the most popular kids in town because it's almost like they resurrected from the dead almost. It's like everybody thought they were dead, and now here they are. And then tomorrow, we'll move on to chapter 18 and 19.